Hello and welcome back to the DAL Global Virtual Summit. And it is absolutely wonderful to be on this panel. I think Zara's panel's just about to pop up there, but this panel is entitled New Leadership Behaviours, Taking Brave, Bold and Authentic Action, a word that you've already heard mentioned a number of times this morning. My name is Leila McKenzie-Delis and I'm the founder and CEO of DAL Global, and I am joined by three phenomenal leaders this morning who I'm delighted to welcome back to the DAL Global virtual stage for the second time today. They are Elly Tomlins, Chief People Officer at Britvic PLC, Neal, Chief People Officer at Communisis, and Dr. Zara, Nanu, who is the founder and CEO of Gapsquare. Welcome all.
Hi. Nice to be here.
So leadership is not about the titles or the corner office, and it's really, we're hearing more so now about this willingness and this want and desire to step up and put your authentic self out there and really lean into brave and authentic action. So in this session, we're going to be hearing from you all here as our trailblazing, inspirational leaders on your individual journeys, both personal and professional, to really step up, take that stand for employee engagement, authenticity, both within your organizations and also externally. But before we get into detail, it'd be great to hear a little bit more about each of you and why you're so passionate about diversity, inclusion and belonging. Elly, I'm going to come to you first.
Thank you, Leila. So we're delighted to be here to start with. It's always a privilege to have these conversations. As you said, my name's Elly Tomlins. I'm the Chief People Officer of Britvic. I joined Britvic in February, and so I'm relatively new in this role. Britvic Soft Drinks makes and bottles all of Pepsi's drinks in the UK, as well as a number of our own brands, and probably drinks that you have in your home. But I've worked in inclusion, diversity and HR for a lot of years now, and it's almost an impossible question about why I find it so fascinating. But I guess I would say I can argue the moral and ethical case for diversity and inclusion till the cows come home. But I also find it a really genuinely fascinating intellectual challenge and an area that's always evolving and changing, and there's so much to learn about yourself and about other people. So as society changes, it's a topic that changes, and therefore I genuinely love it for the day-to-day intellectual wrestle that it gives me.
I love the phrase intellectual wrestle there, Elly, and it is absolutely on point, given the fact that diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity, everyone has an opinion on it, but ultimately it's such a more complex subject than meets the eye. Andrew, coming to yourself.
Sure, hi. And yeah, as you said, so I'm Neal, Chief People Officer of a business called Communisis. We're a marketing services business. We're often stood behind other brands. So unlike the world of Pepsi and Britvic, you probably haven't heard of us, but we'd have probably put something in your hands or you've consumed something we've produced over the last week or so. It's very similar actually to Elly in terms of why I'm here, having been in the HR function for a number of years, and again could argue that the merits for the cows come home. I think at a personal level, the personal values of respect and equality and equity and ring true. I don't think you could probably be in this profession if they didn't. But equally, when I really boil it down as a single dad to a 7-year-old little girl, I feel a very clear accountability to contribute to a world where she can grow up and be who she wants to be and feel she is. So both professionally and personally, this subject resonates. Ethnicity is authenticity. A very personal challenge, and we've talked about this before. And so when you invited me to talk about this subject, it was something I was keen to contribute. And as a business, we've gone through a lot of change, and it's very much a tradition of the old meeting the new. So we've got a lot of interesting dynamics at play. So lots of challenges in this space.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrew. And thank you for sharing as well there about being single father to a 7-year-old. I've just become a mum for the first time to a little IVF baby called Peter, and he's the ripe old age now of 4 months old. And so it is It's great to hear about the personal story there. And last but never least, Dr. Zara Nanu, it's fantastic to have you here with our three esteemed panelists today.
Thank you very much, Leila, and lovely to meet you, Elly and Andrew. Thank you very much for having me here today. So I guess I kind of have two hats in my passion for diversity and inclusion. One, I'm a woman in tech who has started a tech startup, bootstrapped, and subsequently sold the business to Relics PLC last year. So there's that, a thing that I was really passionate about being a woman in tech and really pushing through in this environment. And the other one is what the tech company was about. So I founded Gapsquare to help businesses understand pay gaps, both across gender, ethnicity, and any other indicators, and be able to close those gaps with the help of data. The reason I did that is that in 2015, the World Economic Forum was telling us that we are about 250 years away from achieving parity globally. At the same time, the World Economic Forum was telling us that by 2030, a lot of us will be in self-driving cars. NASA's telling us by 2030, we'll be waving people off to Mars. So at the same time as all of this innovation and technology is happening and moving forward and accelerating and creating progress for humanity, we're still somehow going to be 240 years away from achieving parity between genders while we see all this innovation unfold. So I wanted to start a business in tech so that we can make the most of innovation and utilize technology to help businesses look at their data across payroll and HR and understand how they can accelerate that equality within the workplace so we can create that inclusive, fair place for all. So when we're all there in 2030 in our self-driving cars, waving some people off to Mars, we can be closer to achieving parity at work than 240 years.
Dr. Zara, thank you. 240 years really puts that into context. On the one hand, how far away we are, yet at the same time, we know having leaders like all of you on this panel allow us to really drive tangible action and change. And as leaders, be beacons for that very change that we want to see, not only now, but for future generations of leaders as well. Now, Elly, I'm going to come to you first here because I know you are an absolute culture queen and some of the work done across the board, not only with now dipping toes in to your next opportunity here at Britvic, but some of the things that you've done historically, personally, professionally, and right now have been very, very much around culture and really changing the game from not only a people and an HR perspective, but from that real strategic game-changing perspective. Tell us a little bit about some of the key areas that you've identified. And they could be right now here at Britvic, but they also could be some of those many examples you have from the various other achievements you've had through the career.
Wow, what a broad question to start with, because there's many different ways I could potentially answer that. So, I guess when I look back and I reflect on what does it take to shift the dial, what does it take to change the game, I often start with the importance of leadership. And I think we've all read a huge amount in recent years about how leadership is changing, that pandemic trend where the human face of leadership came forward so much more. We saw compassion, we saw kindness dialing up at a completely different level than we'd seen before. And now, with the well-being trends that are going on, there's a lot of conversation about how performance requires things like rest and recovery to enable peak performance. So there's an awful lot going on at the time about the things that are always changing. What I find quite interesting when I think about the one or two things that I've always rested on is actually, in my years of leadership development and working with CEOs and working with leaders over a couple of decades, I always come back to three really critical traits that actually are true game changers for inclusion and diversity, but for any kind of change, really. They would be curiosity, courage, and self-knowledge. And I always start with curiosity because it's the power for learning and it's the thing that helps people, educate themselves and move things on. And originally came across it at Thomson Reuters when we were doing a lot of work on what does it take to be truly global. If you want to lead diversity and inclusion globally, what is the trait that you need? And we discovered that we did a huge project on it, and we discovered that curiosity had 3 different faces and all were equally important. So curiosity about yourself, curiosity about other people, so the empathetic curiosity to understand what makes people tick and why they are where they are. And actually curiosity about the world, about the cultures we live in, about the differences between those cultures, and then being able to reconcile all those differences intellectually became incredibly important for if a leader wanted to have impact and resonance across different markets. The second thing that we will always come back to, and I think will never be changing, is the importance of courage. And I think, you know, you look at society right now, never has it been more important to be bold, never has it been more important to be brave, and never has it been more important to challenge both yourself and the people you're in, and really hold yourself to account for, you know, stepping into difficult conversations and holding a line, even if it's difficult for yourself personally. And powering both of those, I think, and the thing that helps people in the moment to do both of those things is to really understand yourself and that kind of concept of self-knowledge. And as I was reflecting on your question, I was remembering a leader and teacher and guru who I think developed a generation of HR leaders called Myung Chung Judge, who sadly died this summer. She was an extraordinary OD practitioner who worked not only with every large company in the world, but had also started to work at the government and societal level in reshaping Singaporean society. She was extraordinary. But she used to teach us all so much about the importance of knowing, if you're going to facilitate change, what is going on for you? Because what you have going on will change the dynamic and will change how you come into that conversation, will change how brave you're able to be and how you can frame those words, listening to your inner voice and listening to where you really are. And hammering that home for that generation, it was such an important piece of education for me, and something I've always gone back to, is really coming back to curiosity and courage, being really understanding what you've got going on, because that is what it's going to take. If you don't understand that, you're never going to change the game. So I would always come back to those 3 things. And I suspect no matter what trend we're in, what current zeitgeist we're in, they will be important if you really want to stand up and make a difference. So that's where I'd start. But as I said, brilliantly broad question.
Thanks ever so much, Elly. And the 3 C's that we have: curiosity, 2 C's and 1 S, curiosity and self-knowledge. Would love to know, Andrew and Zara, if there's any further builds at all on that. But as we come to you to ask, some of these societal norms, as you say, Elly, they are absolutely shifting. Challenge, accountability, the employee voice. Literally everyone these days can take to digital or social media. And so actually being accountable for our words, our actions, what we say there as leaders externally, whilst also then being able to step into those difficult conversations, as you say, internally, when actually there are a number of things that are going on for us individually, as people, as leaders. Many different conversations are needing to happen now, be it boardroom table, be it externally. There's an expectation for organizations to be speaking up around, challenging conversations, which probably wouldn't have been happening, 5-10 years ago. But then also that dynamic around kind of employee voice as well, and really ensuring that we do, as you say, dig deep into what it is that makes people tick and how can we bring those cultural kind of idiosyncratic details together. Andrew, any thoughts on Elly's points here? Because I think there was some really rich discussion points raised.
Yeah, definitely. I couldn't agree more with all of that. I think curiosity for me definitely resonated. I think, that being very conscious that you don't know what you don't know, and walking through life and work and everything, being aware of that and being curious and interested, and then when you're finding something that you don't understand or don't know, and whether it be in the spaces we're talking about today, or whether it be just generally in life, it's so critical. There's no stretch, there's no development, there's no growth without that, without accepting there's lots and lots of stuff you just don't get right now, and that curiosity. Yeah, so 100%, sign up for that. I think the other thing is that towards the end we talked about being brave and being bold. I remember a mentor telling me that if you're really going to affect change, Andrew, if you're really going to do this job in the people function really, really well, there's going to be times where you have to stand up and do things and say things that could get you fired, because you're going to oppose opinions, or you're going to oppose views, or you're going to stand up for what you believe, and people will have contrary views. But you're not going to affect change unless you're bold enough to take it all the way and stand behind it. And I think, linked to what you were saying there, Leila, and Elly was saying, I think that that rings true even more now than where we are with a complex world that's increasingly changing at pace.
Zara.
Yeah, no, this is not the first time I hear the word curiosity in a panel, in a conversation around diversity and inclusion, and I love it. I actually started thinking about it as curiosity closed the gap, because it's curiosity and wanting to learn more about structural inequalities within the organization, or anything that data is telling us about representation or about pay, that is going to lead to some questions being asked, and therefore some collective answers being found and identified. So I like that. And one of the other points you were making, Leila, around kind of availability of socials and how that accountability is moving quite quickly through society. And it's true, because many of you would know the Government Equalities Office has introduced legislation in the UK, which requires businesses with 250 employees or more to report on their pay gaps. And we've had that in force for 5 years now. And I think we were seeing some complacency starting to build up around these numbers. Companies were reporting pretty much the same numbers every year on year. We see small 0.02% change year on year, but not much else. And then this year, someone created a bot on Twitter. It was called the Gender Pay Gap Bot. And it was every time for International Women's Day, an organization was tweeting something about International Women's Day, the bot would automatically retweet that with the company's pay gap and say, this company's pay gap is 23%, or this company's pay gap is 40%. So a lot of, actually, as the day progressed, you could see a lot of organizations removing their tweets and deleting their tweets. And you could also hear stories of organizations decided to pause their social media campaigns around International Women's Day for fear of being retweeted by the bot. But in effect, what that has done is a lot of pressure on organizations to actually re-examine where they are and reignited some fire behind the legislation. So definitely that kind of accountability across multiple stakeholders does come into play in this space.
Ooh, I think Zara's frozen for just a moment there, but I was chuckling somewhat just because the bot was a he on International Women's Day, and these tweets were being removed. But it's such a really interesting concept, isn't it? Because it is we do live in this, as I think you pointed out, Andrew, a VUCA world. It's volatile, uncertain, and all the rest of it. There is being brave and there is being bold and speaking out. Yet also there's that huge fear of rebuke at the same time. Where does individual personal boldness, braveness, come to play, in line with company brands and how they wish to be seen? Does that marry up between what is being said and also the employee voice, and so on and so forth? But I am going to come to you, Andrew, with this next question, because actually you've alluded to already a lot about your kind of, the younger people in your life, but actions around your younger self on this importance of authenticity and change. Can you talk a lot about this curiosity piece, the boldness piece? Talk to us a little bit about your younger self on this, and subsequently then those who might be aspiring to be in the positions that you are all in today.
Yeah, and wasn't the Paybot a great example of authenticity and calling out businesses that weren't authentic, right? It was brilliant. I had a journey with this as I sort of growing my career and developing my career, and I worked at a couple of organizations where I was privileged to work with some amazing leaders, either directly or in and around, and I kind of fell into this imitation is flattery and steal with pride and all that kind of stuff, because it felt like a shortcut to getting on, and it cut it for a while. I'd sort of summarize it as what would Zara do, was how I kind of phrased it in my head, because she was a boss that really kind of sort of first boss that sat me down and have influence on driving my career forward. And like I said, it cut it for a while, but you sort of get to a point where it feels like things start to jar, and that's the kind of moment of dawning where you go, I'm not being authentic now, and I'm not behaving, performing, leading, making decisions, whatever it might be, in what's truly authentic for me. And you get into that place of, right now, I need to start defining what I really stand for, and thinking very long and hard about, why does this not feel comfortable, and why does it not feel natural? And that authenticity, when you're in a place where you're clear what your personal values are, what your personal ethics, morals, what's important to you are, it becomes a lot easier to be authentic. It becomes a lot easier to be natural. And I think that the response, whether it be leading teams, whether it be leading change, we've all probably seen examples where someone's been inauthentic and things haven't rung true, and you just don't trust, you don't connect, you don't engage in the same way you do when someone's super authentic and shares things about themselves, or allows them to be put out there and feel maybe exposed. You get to that point of a deeper level of trust. And I think if you're really going to drive change, if you're really going to take people with you, if you're really going to enable something to happen, that you need that connection and that trust. So, rambling on without answering your question, I think if I was to sort of talk to my younger self, or my daughter as she gets older, I think, be clear on what you stand for and what's important for you. What is that hill you're going to die on, and what is that thing you're going to go toe to toe with leadership on and fight the battle for, and accept that's going to be uncomfortable. Accept it's going to be a difficult journey, because you're probably going to do an awful lot of soul searching to get there. I think there's to truly get into what's really core to you is, take some fairly difficult thinking and approach some stuff that maybe you haven't done. So I think accept it's going to be uncomfortable and accept that, but it shows growth, and it shows development, it shows stretch, right? And if I trust your gut, trust your instincts. If you're clear on all the other stuff, your gut will lead you well. There's a reason you get that nagging feeling in your stomach when something's not quite right. And being authentic is listening to that and doing something about it, and standing up for it. So I think it's super important in modern day life. I think we're beyond the phase of leadership where you can read textbooks and understand psychology and think that's enough. It's got to be, you've got to be an authentic leader. You've got to stand up in front of people and be yourself, and people aren't going to get on board unless you are.
Perfectly well said, Andrew. And I can see Elly. I'm feeling myself here, kind of nodding vigorously in agreement here. But some really wonderful nuggets of wisdom there. I like the piece around imitation being flattery and stealing with pride. Yet also, actually, this word of authenticity, it's almost been a little overused to an extent. And every way you have described this in bringing, yourself facing into what are really, often uncomfortable conversations, but also having that trust at the centre of it, absolutely ring true. And if you don't mind me very briefly just coming back as well to some points whilst you were speaking, made me think very much about equity over equality. I know we talk a lot about gender equality, some of the stereotypical aspects of diversity, but actually you very kindly shared there that right at the beginning of this conversation, that you are, a single father. And so actually, if our expectations are to really drive true equality, we need to first recognize equity. We need to recognize that there are differentials within every single area of those dimensions of diversity. And so, the gaps with, even parenting, time off, they need to be equal for women as they do men, as they do other people and other individuals within organizations. But Elly, I'm going to come to you because you were mirroring one another there with our agreement.
I do love nodding along absolutely. So I think there's a really interesting theme around authenticity, because I absolutely agree with you, Andrew. Everyone's got to find their own path, and you really need to and that's a kind of a journey for everybody. I also talk to a lot of, individuals often earlier on in their careers who are dealing with imposter syndrome. And I have to remind them that everyone has, basically everyone I've ever met has always had some sort of version of imposter syndrome. And I often point them at the work of an academic and speaker who's brilliant, a lady called Hermina Ibarra, who's worked on the paradox of authenticity and the trap that people get into when they are trying to learn to be different, that for the period where they are learning a new habit or learning a new behavior or learning a new skill, it feels inauthentic. And they often hold themselves back. And actually, she talks about the mantle, and she talks about trying it on, and she talks about acting into something. And you almost have to go through the period where something feels a bit raw and a bit edgy and a bit different before it becomes comfortable and then therefore feels authentic. And I often use that as a metaphor with people when they are talking to me about imposter syndrome. And I certainly used it myself, to actually just consciously remember to experiment along the way, rather than always saying, to be authentic, I must automatically be able to do it and be able to do whatever I'm asking of myself without trial, error, and to be patient with yourself whilst you're learning something, which I think is just a really nice angle for us all to think about as we are encouraging people to change. Is sometimes there's a period where it feels a bit weird, and then people get themselves into that authenticity trap. So I think there's a really nice nexus in there, because we have to remember to play with things, to experiment, to try stuff out, which brings you straight back to courage. But it's an important, I would always tell my younger self not to worry about imposter syndrome and to just try some stuff on for size a little with some, liberal thought and action.
If I can also add into there, I think in thinking about what I would tell my younger self, if I was going to go back and tell my younger self that I was going to work in tech and deal with math and statistical regression models, I think I would have laughed in my face, because back at that time when I was doing the equivalent of A levels, maths was not for girls. Maths was hard. It was more for boys. You saw very few girls go into this field. And so it's also about like following your journey, because although I didn't do that then, I very much live and breathe maths and tech right now. So it's my life right now. So kind of follow the journey that brought me here. The journey that takes you to a destination isn't always a straight journey, and there's lots to learn along the way. And I think in addition to in feeding into this kind of being yourself and being your authentic self, I think sometimes it's also important to acknowledge the challenges that come with that, especially if you are, say, a young woman in a new career, or if you are a woman in tech, or a woman in a more male-dominated occupation, or a male-dominated kind of pay level and grading within an organization, because it can be hard. The number of times I was at tech events or in tech spaces where I was confused for the waitress, or the person signing people in, or the person who's going to sort out the air conditioner, is too many to be recounted. And it's important to acknowledge that these things do happen and they can be challenging. And sometimes it's easy to wake up the next morning and be like, I'm going to get back on my feet and go and smash it. And sometimes it's hard because you think the whole world is set up differently. So yeah, I guess it's the journey. My addition to this, as I kind of say a lot of words, is that the journey can be different for everyone, and authenticity is sometimes very hard and challenging. And it's just not something to stop us, but more something to acknowledge and recognize.
Oh, sorry, Andrew, you're going to say something.
No, I was just going to say I totally agree.
I think we're all nodding in agreement here, and it is ultimately how we break these systemic barriers and really, as you all are here, be great role models. But we often like to say at Dial, it's those real models as well. It's being what you wish to have seen. To your point, Zara, perhaps when you were being mistaken for a waitress or whomever else within those kind of constructs. And I think the amount of tenacity that it takes to keep on pushing through what has been this almost perceived kind of glass ceiling, is something that is one of the most powerful traits that we can have in the world that we live in today. felt very much, the same myself sometimes, but ultimately, role models, real models, they can come from many different walks of life. They can be male, they can be female. We're sitting with a number of them right here today. And, it's amazing how these different types of influences around you really can have a huge difference, in particular on the younger generation, thinking to themselves, hey, I absolutely can be, an Elly, chief people officer within a large corporate. Andrew, single father, be actually doing it all, having it all with the career, not easy, certainly, but having everything I wish for. And Zara, clearly, being able to grow, scale and exit an organization is just phenomenal. Now, taking the conversation into a different gear, let's talk a little bit about some of the shifts that we found from viewing diversity, inclusion, belonging and equity as an HR imperative. It's one of my favorite subjects of conversation, this one, but to seeing it as from HR to your responsibility and ultimately that of the entire leadership team. Zara, I'm going to come back to you here to kick this one off, and then we'll go back around our group.
Yeah, absolutely. So, such an important question, Leila. And I think the main thing that I'm seeing, we're seeing a lot of data from a lot of organizations across the world, looking at their payroll and HR data to understand inequities within the organization, both in terms of representation, but also in terms of pay and anything else related to that. And what we're seeing is the increased alignment of this agenda with the C-suite. So it's no longer just something that sits within HR or sits with an appointed D&I person, with a role that usually was seconded and usually was done by someone on top of their job. We're seeing kind of increased funding and support and investment into this agenda, both in terms of having it lead in the C-suite conversations around business development. So when the C-suite is talking about business growth, how are we going to grow? How are we going to scale the business? How are we going to maintain those profit margins? They very much are aligned with conversations around how does this fit with our people? How does this fit with fairness within what we're doing with our people, with diversity and inclusion, and the agenda of equity in general. So we're seeing that alignment of the diversity and inclusion agenda with the business imperatives and business growth, which is really great to see. And we're also seeing increased focus on data. I mean, I'm now a data geek, and I know the role that data can play in helping organizations really understand where their gaps are and how they can narrow those gaps faster is huge. A lot of the times, conversations around diversity and inclusion were more or less kind of blanketed in terms of what actions can happen within an organization to address any existing gaps. Data is helping organizations understand there's no one size fit all, and actually everyone has their own issues. And in addition to that, what we also find is the conversations around diversity and inclusion are we're already playing catch up. We're already trying to close existing gaps. And this isn't happening in a vacuum. The world is evolving, roles are evolving, organizations are evolving. You have jobs now that didn't exist 10 years ago. I mean, a digital marketer wasn't something that people did 10, 15 years ago. So within that kind of shifting economy of jobs, you also have additional pressure of creating and facilitating change. And again, data is that point that can help bring everything together and help organizations shape more inclusivity and more diversity. It seems counterintuitive because it's like, the way I think about it, diversity and inclusion is very much about authenticity, about the journey, about inclusivity. And data seems very hard and rough. Like, what does data understand about people? But actually, when you look at the entire organization and you look at that data, it helps bring everything nicely together.
Well, you're here with a fellow data geek, Zara, and I'll come to yourself, Elly, in just a moment. But as you rightly said, this is a board-wide issue. We need to have buy-in from our leadership. It's not just an HR issue. We've got brilliant HR leaders who are beacons of change and transformation, but they cannot be expected to do this alone. It needs absolute fundamental buy-in from our CEOs, our boards, our other leaders, in order for it to trickle down throughout the branches, the roots, the leaves of the organisations. But Elly, I'll come to yourself first, and then Andrew, to you.
Yeah, well, just let me comment briefly. I certainly fully agree with you, Zara, that data is the fuel for all these conversations, the fuel to understand how you're tracking. And without it, you're really stabbing in the dark in terms of working out whether your interventions are actually doing anything anyway. I mean, and because I've been in this space a long time, I would say, the first 5, 7, 8 years, we spent a lot of time talking about the business case and trying to talk about the business case and talking about the value of innovation and why diversity gave better performance outcomes and so on. And now it feels different, actually. You don't talk about the business case anymore. And now I get emails from our investors asking where we are, whether we are compliant against the Parker review, or whether we are compliant against the Hampton-Alexander 30% target, and what our ESG targets are and how they're built into our bonuses. And luckily in a PLC environment, you get quite a lot of that. The energy that's now coming off the investor community is genuinely different. And I think that focuses the mind. And if you're in an organization that has built those things into your bonus pool, it's increasingly the trend, because the expectation that you're, as an organization, are having an impact on society, but it's also building a sustainable business for the future generations, is increasingly part of a broad suite of those stakeholder expectations. And that has fundamentally changed the attitude of the entire organisation and the leadership team to the conversation. And it is quite different now, because you're starting from the position of, right, we all know this is a good idea. What are we going to do to shift the dial, and how do we actually accelerate our progress? I'm hugely grateful that I'm no longer in the conversations about the business case.
I agree, and I think the business case has shifted from what's the ROI to it's the right thing to do, is one sentence on the page, and let's move on and get on with it type thing, as opposed to spend, as you say, months worrying about it. Just to on your last point around investors, and similarly with the privately owned space, but again, investors asking all the same questions as much as they're asking around financial metrics. We're also seeing it very heavily from a client perspective as well. So our client base of a mixture of financial institutions, FMCG type organisations, are acutely aware of this as a critical part of their business, and therefore expect it from us as well. So there are additional pressures that help this become a business issue and not a people function issue, which is great. I think I look at my leadership team, and I feel pretty lucky that I've got a gender balanced leadership team that gets this, and I've got female COOs that are passionate about getting young females into tech and into manufacturing, which is brilliant. So pushing on open doors. But I think the other thing we've done that feels like it's made traction, to talk sort of slightly tactically, you've got to make space for it though, and you've got to give the organisation permission. So, example, we're running listening sessions about various subjects around diversity, and we ran sessions on pride, and we talked about pronouns, and we talked about what a good ally is, and all that kind of stuff. And our chief exec came along to the session. I'm sure he won't mind me repeating this, because he said it's 300 people, so another few thousand can't hurt. He came along to the session and said, do you know what, until I sat down and had a conversation with Ricky, who's one of the guys that works for Responsible Business, and Ricky really explained what pronouns were all about, I didn't get it. And I then realised that I didn't get it, and now I do. So I want everyone else to try and go through that same journey with me. And that was incredibly powerful for the organisation to hear the boss turn around and show a bit of vulnerability that said, I'm learning this stuff, and it's okay if we all learn it, but I want us all to learn it. And then it shifted that focus away from it being the people function tending to do something to, as an organisation, this is what I expect of us to be doing. And it also gave everyone else permission to feel like they didn't understand it too, but also the space to go and learn. So, and we've had the same sort of conversation around women in leadership, had the same conversation about mental health. And we find colleagues starting to share very personal stuff, and that then it spurs off and it becomes by osmosis through the organisation. They then connect after the calls. And I have lots of conversations. Colleagues come back to go, oh, I've had 3 people reach out and talk about my experience of, and actually, Leila, you shared about IVF. We're talking about our parental policies and how do we build more support in around IVF, because I've had a colleague come to us and say, I've now got 4 people ask me, but I don't feel I can represent the business on this. So help me build something else. Perfect. That for me is the sign of the business owning it, because now the business is coming back to us and saying, we found an area we need to do more on, and can you help us do it? And so that's worked for us.
I love the way that you're talking about diversities within diversities here, Andrew, and the fact that, I mean, we're almost full circle back to where we started. This is a far more complex conversation to a certain extent than actually meets the eye. What is diversity? Well, it's the difference amongst us all, you know, that diversity of mindset that we have from all of our different rich experiences. But IVF within the context of parenthood and caring responsibilities, amongst many other areas. We're talking a lot more about the menopause now, which is wonderful. Again, many other areas within each of those different facets. But how do we track it? How do we measure it? How do we manage it? How do we utilize the engagement from our wonderful groups, often employee resource groups within the organizations, to really spearhead this? But then how do we, as you are yourself, Andrew, being vulnerable enough as leaders to actually share? Because the trickle effect that I think you were describing is how you've created that safe space that then starts to cascade throughout the organization. CEOs, CPOs say, share their personal stories. It keeps going down each level of the classically corporate hierarchy almost. So really good to hear. Any other final thoughts before we start to wrap up and summarize?
I'll have a quick final thought. I think there's a lot of points of discussion, and this is indeed, as you say, Leila, a very complex issue, and it's important that we continue these conversations. And I mentioned at the beginning, we're 200 plus years away from closing any gaps, but I think we also have to understand that we can't boil the ocean. Anything that we do right now after finishing this call in terms of actions we can take in our places of employment, they can't be about boiling the ocean, because then we'll never succeed and we'll also feel very bad about ourselves in the process. It's more about doing it one kettle at a time and one small step at a time, because in the end, all of our small actions day by day will lead to bigger change.
Mm-hmm. I love that, because it was mirroring a phrase that was going around in my head, which was just to remember that culture changes one conversation at a time. So if the invitation to be bold and go for it, but do it one conversation at a time.
Yeah, and I think I agree with all of that. And I think the other overriding thing that I've been thinking about is that back to that bravery and boldness point. You're not going to boil the ocean, you can't. But to go after even the one kettle at a time, still needs to be brave and bold and lean into it.
Mm. Oh my goodness, I could stay on this panel all day. There's so many things that I'm trying to wrap into a summary in my mind right now. But culture change, diversity, inclusion, belonging, it is a constant evolutionary process, as I think you have all alluded to. It's wonderful to hear that we are finally through the not speaking about this necessarily as a business case at the board. We all know why. We all have the quotes that we can, sit there and say, more business, more profitable, etc., etc. But actually, this conversation now is becoming far more rich. The investor community, the board conversations around sustainability, stakeholder expectations are changing, moving on rapidly. The acceleration process for all of these different facets is really moving on, because we live in a far more educated world in a way, where actually, there's lots and lots of different things happening in business and politics, in society, and we want to keep inspiring this positive change without this fear of rebuke. Now, a couple of quick last things just before we summarize for this panel are to say a huge, big thank you to all of you. It has been, truly insightful having you all here. I know that the chat will have been going crazy on the front end inside the summit. So thank you to all of those that are putting comments in on the front end in the chat. I know, like myself, you'll have learned a huge amount from our leaders today on the panel around accountability, conversations, stepping out, stepping up, as Elly put it, curiosity, courage, and also self-knowledge and self-belief, just to add to that, incredibly important. Now, for those who are inside the summit, please do look to the left of your screen for speed networking and the virtual booths during our advertisement break. And make sure you tag Dial Global, use our social media handle. It's #MovingTheDial. As ever, do join us after this short break to hear from a phenomenal panel which is entitled Driving Change, and it's a lens on our intersectional McKenzie-Delis view. Enjoy.